Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and today I wanted to do a video that's probably a long time coming, but is really designed to hopefully prepare you for the Pyro system, whenever that may come to fruition. Overall, the topic today is the most important ships for the Pyro system, at least in my mind. Now, that isn't to say that this is going to be an all-encompassing list, or the only options that matter, but I do want to talk about what we think we know about what makes Pyro different, and why having a perspective on how certain ships fit into these unique differences could be important in the long term. So let's start with what we think we know about Pyro. Not as a system in general, because if you really want to learn that and the lore behind it, I have an Exploring the Star Map video to explain that lore, but more specifically, what we think we know about what makes Pyro different from Stanton, which is where we've been playing because that will build our foundation on what is important and why. First off, Pyro is known to be a challenging environmental system. The star is in a state of throwing prolonged solar flare activity, which is supposed to bring heavy radiation and heat to those that are going to be impacted. Now, I have to imagine a few things with that. It could mean new types of alerts in the game. Maybe it could mean that heat is an issue if you're too close to the center of the system. But radiation could impact things at long ranges in certain directions as well. And probably most relevant would be that long-term we could see different implications, but short-term this is probably not going to be a huge issue because environmental effects really only have an impact on you as a person, not necessarily on your ship yet from like a wear and tear perspective. More important to the short-term, though, is what we think we know about the planets and the moons, which is that we have more unpredictable environments. There tends to be heavy winds, there's differing weather, and challenging landscapes. In the Stanton system, the planets were all terraformed, but based on the solar activity and other challenges in Pyro, that system didn't have a lot of successful terraforming. So things don't act like we would expect them to on the planets that were built more by design than nature in the system that we're familiar with. Based on those challenges, we didn't see a heavy corporate sector moving in either, and because of that, we didn't have a whole lot of security to go along with it. And with access to many more profitable areas, meaning different connecting systems, this ended up being a convenient place for lawless actors to take up a stronghold. That created a pirate haven, or an outlaw post, or whatever you want to call it, and a safe place for many different outlaw factions. That lack of security led this to becoming a very dangerous area, where we can expect to see less security, less law enforcement, and probably the type of work that would keep the system a little bit safer is probably going to be contracted out by factions in power. And you should probably read that as the system's lawful missions. Or they could be challenged by challenging factions, those that are trying to gain power in the system. And those are most likely going to be your unlawful missions. Which means that players and NPC probably take on the lion's share of security jobs. And the factions that you're building rep with may change power over time somewhat frequently, which could impact how you decide which missions you take. A more simple implication of this system would be that many to all of the places that you visit are not going to have monitored zones, meaning that you either fight and you win or die, or you run and escape, but you're not really going to have that safe place to go where monitoring really means anything to any player or NPC. Now, that lack of lawful protection also means that this system doesn't have some of the same amenities that you may be familiar with. There isn't that same consistency of R&Rs distributed at Lagrange points and in reliable positions, making it easy to jump around the system, and fewer total stations, along with less planetary outposts with the same level of tech and capabilities that you're familiar with. It all means that you have less access to repairs, refueling, and rearming. Less infrastructure of the in-system economy also means that there's more reliance on trade to bring in the assets that you want, which means likely more supply shortages, not only for commodities, but maybe also for the normal ship upkeep items like parts and repairs and ammunition and all of that. There's also less known in Pyro, since we haven't really had that large military presence involved, sending pathfighters in to identify all the locations and get it mapped out like we've seen in Stanton. And with less corporate involvement and less terraforming, the known locations are significantly more limited, meaning that you probably have a higher chance to run into more asteroid clusters and belts, which means that you might be dropping out of quantum in areas that have hostile forces that are waiting for you there. But on the flip side of that, potentially this could be our real first opportunity for exploration ships to mean something if capturing information, selling it, and turning a profit off of that becomes a thing. Where there's less eyes, there is much easier processes for buying and selling Vice products. But with less eyes, there also comes an increase in risk from others who are hoping to profit from what is yours, which leaves you with the old high-risk, high-reward equation. Beyond drugs, there's also known to be a lot of combat here, which also means a chance for a lot of profit to be made from salvage, either in a holistic group way or through missions that may be offered, because after all, a lot of what salvage materials come back with is the stuff that's needed for repairing stations and ships, which means that you can speak to the limitations that we already talked about earlier, meaning these jobs may be needed and profitable. The final piece to address is probably your most significant impacted one for Pyro, which is the size. The Stanton system is measured to be 5.2 AU. An AU is simply stated as being the distance between Earth and the Sun in real life, so Stanton is basically 5 times that distance in total size, which basically, if you look at it, is the size of our solar system from Sun to Jupiter. Considering Neptune, I think, is 30 AU from the Sun, we're dealing with much smaller numbers in Stanton, which made it an easy starting point for us as players to get used to navigating a solar system. However, Pyro is 13 AU in total size, which means that it's 2.5 times larger than Stanton, which may not seem huge overall, but if you consider how many ships today can't jump from one end to the other end of Stanton currently, and further, how many can't go there and back, the size definitely means something. That becomes an even further issue when you don't have that same infrastructure that you do in Stanton to be able to stop for fuel along the way because stations are more dispersed, which means longer travel times based on distance, but also because the necessity of course planning that it takes for you to be able to route your way to reach your destination. Overall, while size might always not mean everything in puns or in Star Citizen, when it comes to Pyro, size definitely matters. So based on everything that I've shared so far, there are a few things that I want to look for in the ships that I would pick to set me up for success, or generally that I feel are important for the system. First off, based on the environmental effects, I think VTOL thrusters are going to be a huge benefit based on their ability to help you land and take off, along with being able to hold you steady in extreme weather conditions without requiring so much of your attention on your controls. I also think that ships that can endure heat and radiation challenges when getting in close proximity to the star, like ships with heavy armor or shielded canopies, may make a difference. Heavier and larger combat ships are likely important, regardless of shields or armor focus, though I personally think that armor matters more since all shields recharge. But the ships that let you stay out and fight without needing to go back and repair, I think are going to be pretty critical. Beyond that, with the larger combat ships, those also mean they have more fuel. And I think that's going to matter a ton. I also look at the multi-purpose ships that are less focused on a single role as being important, because if you have a specialist and trouble shows up, if all of your capabilities are in one area, and that's a non-combat skill, you could be in for a lot of trouble. Supply ships are also going to be in great demand, as well as those that can bring in goods from other systems to supplement what's known to be a limited economy on its own. It's going to be pretty big from a profit perspective, I think. So now that we have all of that out of the way, let's dive into some ship talk. I think a logical starting point would be to talk about the types of ships that I don't recommend for Pyro, which, like I already mentioned, includes most of your fit-to-function ships that are not combat-focused. Think ships like the Prospector or the Hull series. With little security or safe spaces, if your specialty isn't in fighting and then trouble shows up, you likely don't have what you need in order to keep yourself safe. And historically, these ships aren't great at getting out of trouble through speed. Now, I think a ship like the Reclaimer, which is technically a specialist, is big enough with plenty of firepower, meaning it can probably hang a bit better than some of the others. But as a general rule, specialist ships in industrial professions aren't going to be recommended in this environment. However, there aren't really specialists that fight well. So if there are jobs that you want to do, the ships may be required, but they will likely be best suited for having escorts capable of buying you time to just keep you safe. And I think that's how we're going to see some of these professions play out. Now, I'm going to start by giving some recommendations on ships that are more multi-purpose in nature that I feel are good fits for Pyro. And then we'll extend the list a little bit to get into recommendations that didn't fit into this group. Now, if we start on the smaller side of the ships here, I think the Cutlass series has to be mentioned. The black is the version that can maximize space usage by having the most cargo ability along with the vehicle carrying ability. If you opt for the blue, you get some more weapons and components upgrades. You do lose a little bit of cargo space for the holding cells, but it also probably opens up bounty hunting later. And you also get a quantum dampener, which will keep your targets in place if you can stay close enough to keep them from jumping. Ironically, the ship that we all hated on, the Cutlass Steel, which was really hated on from a price perspective, I think, may actually be one of the best of the group based on physical armor that it brings along, which drastically increases the HP on the ship, which, as mentioned before, I find more valuable than good shields. Overall, regardless of your Cutlass choice, the ship is capable of fighting and doing a pretty good job of it. It can carry cargo and vehicles, has room for many people on board with beds for logging out in this large system, and comes with VTOL thrusters to help control landings and deal with weather. It isn't the fastest ship, and the range isn't spectacular, but it far outclasses Size 1 ships, and it does enable a lot of gameplay. Up next is the Constellation series, with the Andromeda being my favorite of the group for this system. The Taurus, sure, it gets you more cargo, and yes, the Aquila may get you better exploration abilities at some point, but of those variants, they're going to be sacrificing a turret in order to do their jobs. And in Pyro, when some of your most dangerous assets are in the form of turret gunners, I would hate to sacrifice that turret and, turn your offensive and defense abilities, make them a little bit worse. The Andromeda also comes with the Merlin snubcraft that allows you to deploy a miniature fighter when you need it, or potentially you could just use the ship to get out into difficult areas, or even just kind of act as an away craft for your missions that can handle better in different environments. The Connie is also made to carry an Ursa rover, so it has some vehicle hauling ability, though I would probably pick something a little bit smaller to make sure you still have some more room for cargo. There are a lot of pilot-controlled weapons of decent sizing. The number of missiles you have on the Andromeda is frankly astounding. And the shields in the fuel range on this ship are going to give you a lot of protection and make sure you're not stopping all that often. The Connie also has VTOL fans to help make it easier on up and downs for landings on the planets, and give you that stability that you need in poor weather conditions. Along similar lines, if you like the Constellation, you almost have to take a good look at the Corsair, which honestly seems to have been made to be the Pyro version of the Constellation. While the shields on the Corsair are a little bit less and you don't have that snub fighter connected, the Corsair has better firepower, specifically forward-facing, along with larger missiles, which makes the Corsair a very scary ship to have if you're in their sights. The Corsair also has good scanners, and like the Andromeda, it also has good onboard facilities and spaces for your crew. Now, while the Constellation carries more cargo, the amount on the Corsair isn't a slouch either, and that space with a good ramp leading up to it serves well for hauling a vehicle around. Overall, both the Connie and the Corsair are excellent choices, and I would probably say pick either, but choose the Corsair if you're planning on doing a little bit more hunting, or go with the Constellation if you're just trying to do other things, but you know you're going to need to defend yourself at times in case of trouble. Both ships have a little bit of the exploration capabilities, while I think that favors the Corsair in general, unless you compare it up against the Aquila, but then you're losing out on some of what makes the Andromeda special, so I think you kind of pick which of those two ships fits your needs and your desired gameplay a little bit better. If we go slightly larger still, but definitely worth discussing, it's the Anvil Carrack. The exploration-focused ship was originally designed for the Navy, meaning that it has extraordinary range, a ton of HP, decent weapons, though not a ton, and a significant amount of cargo space. You've got a garage for a ground vehicle, and somewhat unique to this list, the ship has a hangar on top that can fit a small fighter. On top of all of that, the Carrack has a medical bay to deal with issues that may allow you to keep your crew alive until you're able to get to a proper hospital, or even potentially fix them completely. And you also have a small repair bay for fixing items that may need attention while you're out in the dark. The Carrack is big, and it's an expensive option, but I think it's kind of perfectly suited for being used as a multi-role ship in Pyro. Now, I think a ship that's worth mentioning in the multi-purpose space is potentially the Nomad, though it is arguably pretty small. However, the ability to carry something like a rock in the back, which does feel a little bit sketchy at times as it kind of hangs out the back of that truck bed, but it also comes with decent living quarters. It flies well. It's got a decent range for a small ship, so it could be a contender if you're looking for something smaller. But frankly, it's going to be very outclassed by larger ships, more fully functioned ships. And the last ships that I want to call out are the 400i and the 600i. While you may not normally think of luxury ships as being the right choice for the Pyro system, they both are easily controlled by a single person. They have a cargo room, they have decent shields, decent weapons, and an ability to carry vehicles, which altogether makes them desirable ships in a variety of roles. If you're trying to hone in on cargo a little bit more specifically, I would skip the temptation to use a hull series. I mean, the volume is unquestionably attractive. However, it makes you a huge target, and that means that you're at tremendous risk. The cargo is also held externally, so the chances of you losing some cargo during a scuffle is pretty high, and in that scuffle, you also don't have a significant amount of firepower to keep yourself safe, and it's not fast or nimble. I do think that there will be times when bringing goods into or out of the Pyro system from Stanton will make sense, but to do this in a vacuum without escorts would be foolish. So it isn't just my standard recommendation. I think if you wanted to do cargo, I would personally be looking at the Hercules Starlifter and probably the C2 and M2 models. Both are tough ships with a ton of shielding and HP. You do get a little bit more on the M2, so you have a little extra durability and some upsized weaponry. If you're running without escorts, as long as you have a crew to help with the turrets, I think either of these ships is a good option. And it has surprising speed and durability, meaning that your ability to run until you can jump without worrying about being insta-popped is attractive. You also have the drive-on, drive-off ramp that allows you to haul vehicles and cargo simultaneously and supports future versions of the game where physical loading of cargo will be a requirement, and this will make it easier. You also have the ability to carry some of the largest vehicles in the game. On board, you do have a variety of amenities that will keep your crew well cared for, and the Crusader ships tend to be a lot of fun to fly. Both of these ships are your best cargo options for Pyro, in my mind, with the M2 being a little bit safer, while the C2 provides the most cargo ability. For me, the C2 is my sweet spot, but your mileage may vary a little bit. Another ship to consider in cargo would be the Caterpillar, which doesn't carry as much cargo, it isn't as durable, and it flies a little bit worse. But it does come with a cheaper price tag and still gets the job done. I much prefer the Hercules, but the Cat has kind of a cult following that are going to get people recommending this ship, and I don't disagree with that, especially knowing that we have the promise at some point of a ton of versatility coming in how you kit out the Caterpillar. From a salvage perspective, the Reclaimer is kind of the no-brainer. The ship's huge, but it is also a tank, making it one of the few specialist ships that I actually think finds a decent role in the system. Combat is a known, so there should be a ton of ships for you to strip. Whether you're following combat operations or if you're just looking for something to do and finding something out in the wild. Your staying power is tremendous based on a few factors. The overall HP of the ship is massive. The components supporting your shields are large. The weaponry, if you're crewed up, is pretty significant, and you have very large fuel tank sizes. Regardless of how you look at the Reclaimer, it's a worthy option that can do its intended role in an environment that sets it up for success. Now, where you need to be a little bit wary is if you just try to use this big girl understaffed, because sneaking into your ship may end up being a bigger threat than a full-on assault, so don't consider yourself impregnable, because you're probably not, but you do have a lot of factors playing in your favor. Now, smaller ships like the Vulture can be profitable, but considering your very significant lack of defensive or offensive abilities, you will get into a lot of trouble if you're engaged. So it's not really a recommended ship, but more of a best, or it's not really not a recommended ship, but it's really more of a, you best be ready by having preparation on your side. Now, that can be done through having escorts, or potentially you're just paying a little bit closer attention to your radar, but you need to be on your toes. Considering the significant price difference between a Reclaimer and a Vulture, the Vulture is still a much more achievable ship for most players in the game, and I see Salvage as being big gameplay in Pyro, so it is a good option, but you just need to be careful out there. I think combat ships are some of the more natural ships to consider in this contentious combat heavy sector of space, but I think you might start to see a shift of the types of ships that are generally used. In Stanton, the prevalence of stations to repair, rearm, and refuel means that you have a lot of flexibility in your ship choices. Picking something small, like the natural inclination to grab an arrow or a gladius, makes a lot of sense in Stanton because they're hard to hit, they're fast, they have decent weaponry, upkeep is cheap, and they just fly nice. They are the default dogfighters for most in the game we're playing today. But with small fuel tanks and low HP pools and not carrying tons of munitions, the environment in Pyro doesn't suit them as well. Granted, if you have something that can carry them, which isn't a lot of ships right now, they will still play. But if you're just looking for a ship that you can take out and do work with, I look towards heavier fighters in Pyro. I also look at ships that are capable of loading out a bunch of guns, so you can kind of go heavy on your energy weapons that are going to be able to keep you out for longer, instead of the very limited ammunition that you have on ballistics. I think a few of my favorite fighters for Pyro would probably be the Vanguard, the Banu Defender, and the F8 Lightning. The Vanguard has a lot of durability and some pretty significant fuel tanks with some decent weaponry as well. I like the fact that the quad size 2s on the nose can be laser cannons that pack a decent punch, even though I dislike the flexibility that they provide. But that nose gun can be large or smaller to maximize your capacitor amounts, and the overall damage output can be very significant coming off the Vanguard. You also have beds on the interior for logging out in the void, and overall the Vanguard is just a great choice. The Defender is kind of an interesting option because damage output is fairly mediocre, but the flight model is decent, and the size 2 shield on the smaller fighter provides an advantage that basically no other ship in this category can really compete with. You also have good range, and the ship is more capable than others in similar sizes than you might expect, which is actually better than a Vanguard in fuel tank size, which has been labeled as a relentless pursuer or something like that. So the Banu Defender, which sometimes is kind of a forgotten ship, might actually have a pretty good home in the Pyro system. The F8 is probably your best choice from a balance perspective of being somewhere between the smaller fighters from a flight model and the heavier ones that we just discussed. It has a ton of weapons, it has good range, there's more whole HP than a Vanguard, and it flies more true and acts like a fighter than the larger and more driftier options. It's probably my favorite fighter option for Pyro currently. Now, if you're looking for larger ships, we're not going to dive into them too much since the issues that we see are mostly negated by them being bigger with more HP and fuel, but I really like ships like the Retaliator and that ability to act as a gunship with all of the turrets, as well as bringing torpedoes for the unknown larger threats. I also like the Constellation Andromeda and the Drake Corsair being great options based on all of that we've already talked about, along with the Carrack playing in the same space. I think refueling is going to be big business in Pyro. And with that in mind, the only refueling ship that we have has to get a shout out here, and that's the Starfarer. Beyond the ability to support fleet operations, but also making money doing refueling to those that are stranded, the Starfarer also has good cargo space and decent HP, so it can serve as a pseudo multi-role ship. However, it flies like a pig and has a miserable cockpit experience, so it's not really ideal for much outside of its intended role. Kind of looking on the flip side of that, mining is a little bit of a tricky topic because in a lot of ways it's really similar to salvage in concept. You don't buy anything. You just go out, you find stuff, you collect it, and you return it somewhere for money. I think there's going to be plenty of options for mining in Pyro, but where I do get a little bit worried is that unlike salvage, where you have the reclaimer that is very capable of being out solo, I really don't I have some doubts about the other two options that we currently have in game for mining and being the prospector and the mole, and how well suited they are to being solo. You're really best at hoping no one notices you or really just doesn't care about you, but if you are engaged, you're kind of in a lot of trouble. So I think I would prefer the prospector in Pyro, and if you have other players with you, I would like them probably in an escort ship to help keep you safe as opposed to having more crew in the same ship. Because you don't really have a lot of turrets on the mole that are combat focused. You're all mining turrets. But I guess some of how things are implemented in Pyro will impact what that recommendation actually ends up being. We're almost done here, but I do have a few honorable mention ships that I want to throw out there. With combat, I didn't mention the Super Hornet or similar ships, like the Heartseeker and all of those. I think they will do a nice job in Pyro, but they didn't get voted in based on the smaller fuel tanks, increasing their reliance on stopping to refill at stations. I think the damage output perspective and the number of weapons you have and the ability to take a beating, the Super Hornet is a good choice if you don't mind taking terrible routes to get places. Another ship that I like is the MSR, which is the Mercury Star Runner. I think it could make for a good cargo ship or maybe a ground transportation option. It's fast, it has good acceleration, it's got decent durability, it's got great range. It's got some decent onboard facilities too. The ship is a ton of fun to fly as well, but the combat presence on the ship is pretty meh at best. I do love the ship for Pyro, but it's probably going to be your runaway if you get engaged ship versus the stay and fight and then move on ship in my kind of personal opinion. And the last honorable mention is going to be the Argo SRV, which may have a role in getting out of ships that are out of fuel, or maybe just damaged ships back to facilities. And that may happen pretty frequently in Pyro. But how it, kind of how it manages on its own, it's probably going to be a little bit impacting based on its overall fuel capacity and its range. It's not a super long distance ship now, and I have to imagine you use more fuel when you're towing a ship. So how that actually works in reality in Pyro is going to be an interesting one to kind of monitor. And there are finally some ships that are still in concept that I think are going to be hugely important once they finally arrive in the game. First off, the Liberator. It's kind of a small carrier type craft that's designed to take ships and vehicles different places. And I really felt like the Liberator was specifically built for systems like Pyro to kind of allow players to stair-step into dealing with a larger system. And I'm still holding out hope that it makes an appearance for the release. But once it's in, it's not only going to support your group's operations, and it's going to open up some smaller range ships to being more optional, but it should also be a decent business model to try and ferry people around systems as needed. With lacking facilities in the system, I see the upcoming Vulcan repair, rearm, refueling ship that uses the drones to get the job done as providing a lot of benefit without the significant investment into multiple larger ships that handle those professions individually. The Crucible is also going to probably be pretty big from a top tier repair facility when stations are not convenient. And it also has some ability to do a little bit of ship ferrying around in a pseudo carrier way. And I think that's going to play pretty well similar to the Liberator. And then finally, we can end by really just bordering on the obvious. But ships like the Kraken, the Polaris, the Idris, the Javelin, etc. The upcoming very large and somewhat capital ships have a lot of value in having hangars and large weapons and huge range and some repair facilities and basically being the aircraft carriers of the game. And those are going to be the ones that are going to serve as mobile bases that make players feel more comfortable and supported out in the wild. Now, how quickly we get those, we don't know. And while all have little differences in what they can do or how well they'll do it, that type of ship, your mobile base, is going to be important in space once we have them in the game. So I think that's basically it. My personal opinions and some of my patrons' recommendations were wrapped into this video. There are obviously a ton of ships in Star Citizen, and there are others that are likely awesome in this space. So if you feel like something was left out that deserves consideration, make your case in the comments. But that's it for now, so thank you for watching. Stay tuned for a whole lot more coming soon. Have yourselves a wonderful day, and take care.